the title, Polarization Takes Place, I think I'm in a way, here, new line, wherever I stand. Polarization takes place is meant quite literally. Polarization, radicalization. And that's the key assumption or hypothesis, if you will, of that project Sarah and I were involved in, is that it is not an amaterial, aspatial phenomenon. Yes, certainly there is a political, mental, psychological dimension to polarization, but human beings have a body, they have eyes, they have ears, they work with physics, acoustic waves, sight lines, they can be injured. So polarization takes place in streets, behind walls, behind windows, in parks, in cafes, etc. So this explains the title of this research project I was leading, The Urban Environment, Mirror and Mediator of Polarization. I'll explain the terms in just a minute. Artifacts, objects, things, walls, fences, steel, brick, glass, in that sense is seen as a symptom, a mirror, or an effect of socio-political conditions. But vice versa, it also, we believe, artifacts have the potential to influence socio-political conditions, behaviors. And it is this kind of way of thinking both ways, how humans and the material influence each other. A research tradition called Science and Technology Studies, STS, I would say is pretty good at getting a grasp on this phenomenon. One of the luminaries in this field, Bruno Latour, tells the story of a door to explain that relationship between the material and the social. People invented doors to keep out cold air. Otherwise, they could have just knocked a hole in the wall and that it. But that's not satisfactory. So the idea is you close the door after you've used it to keep the cold air out. But not everybody closes the door reliably. Well, no problem for a kind of engineering-minded person. We install a mechanical door closer, right? But imagine a plumber with a long pipe coming in. The door might close too quickly, so he puts a wedge underneath the door to keep it open. If he forgets to remove the wedge afterwards, the door is open again. No problem. There is a potential material response to that. We can install a sensor that keeps the door open as long as needed. But that, of course, opens the door to anyone, dogs, uninvited guests, etc. No problem. As a technical response, we can install a chip card reader. So this story could go on and on and on. It's just to illustrate how, whether you acknowledge it or not, whether you like it or not, the material and the social, the technical and the human is always very complexly intertwined. So the lower set of arrows, that's what I mean with the material as a mirror of the social, or as an effect and symptom of it. And the arrows pointing from left to right, this is what I mean by the mediating or agency of the material. And why not translate this from the story of a door to a city? So the urban environment, in a sense, mirrors what's going on in people's minds and heads. That's kind of the alien perspective. If an alien comes from Mars and lands in Beirut and looks around, is not able to read our books and our newspapers. But if it's an intelligent being, that alien might be able to conclude from what that alien is seeing on the street to what kind of social condition must be there that creates this material situation. A few examples from Belfast, the urban environment as a mirror. You see a neighbourhood there, pretty close to the center of the city, and it's amazing how many dead ends, cul-de-sacs there are everywhere. The alien could interpret this as an attempt to prevent shoot-and-run attacks. And that is indeed the rumor among planners and architects that this was deliberate design to stop people from driving by, shooting out of the window and accelerating, getting out. In that case, it's very difficult. You have to turn around, stop first, turn around, go out again. Or a wall intended to separate Catholics and Protestants. Painted curbstones, they mirror the urge of certain groups to display their identity visually. Belfast tries to attract tourists, so they try to embellish peace walls. This is actually a peace wall there. Smaller one, it's not such a contested trouble spot, but it still tries to keep Catholics and Protestants apart from each other. But many tourists come along this route and they want to be shocked right on the way from the airport to the city centre. A gate in a peace wall intended to allow some kind of interaction between Catholics and Protestants during peaceful times, during the day. And it gets close at night. Conceptual tools from STS, Science and Technology Studies. To understand this, it's a whole debate about the controversies behind the design of certain artifacts. Interpretive flexibility, it's not always clear what a building, for example, should be. There are all kinds of competing interpretations sometimes of what a building, a fence, a tower is. Certain social groups are involved in the design of artifacts, and usually one social group dominates the interpretation, the definition of certain artifacts, and that's what STS scholars call a closure. Of course, planning theory contributes to the understanding of the process of how socio-political conditions get translated into materiality, architectural theory, sociology, etc. Now switch gears, the urban environment as mediator, the agency, if you will, of artifacts. Same image as before. There are unintended side effects. The people who live there now, they were actually resettled from a conventional terraced house development from the late 19th century. This was built in the 70s. Elderly people complain that in this setting, they are cut off from society. Because in the past, they were leaning out the window on the first floor, and they saw people walking by, they said hi to the neighbors, they saw people come and go. They were visually and acoustically integrated into the social network. Here they see just two neighbors at the end of their cul-de-sac. That's it. And they feel quite lonely. A peace wall has an effect, unintended side effects. Some, of course, are intended to keep warring factions apart, but children who grow up near a peace wall, they are told by the peace wall that there are others over there. So even though a child grows up in a liberal family that does not indoctrinate their children with us and them, the peace wall tells them there's something going on, us and them. Of course, this keeps, in that case, that's a signal of loyalists or unionists, Protestant community. It signals Catholics or nationalists to stay away. Ironically, it attracts tourists because they want to see that. The trees there have an unintended side effect. It allows perpetrators to climb up and to throw stones or even worse objects even further into enemy territory. So at a number of peace walls, the trees were actually cut down again. This gate, someone told me, triggers a certain commuting behavior of the person I talked to. Because he knows the gate closed at 5. If he doesn't get through that gate by 5, he has to do a long detour. So he leaves work at about 4:30, which pisses off his boss. So that gate triggers a certain behavior, which has nothing to do with conflict. But the gate has an agency. Again, tools, intellectual, conceptual tools to understand this phenomenon. Madeleine Krisch talks about scripts that are embedded in objects. Latour talks about programs of action. Other expressions, concepts would be agendas. Objects can have agendas, so they can be an attempt to outsource virtue. The effect of the peace wall, for example, telling a child that there's something going on, us and them, might be able to tell this as, to frame this as materiality as a socializing effect. When it talks about technological somnambulism, is because if you grow up in a certain setting, you tend not to critically reflect upon your physical environment. It just is natural, it's kind of second nature. Environmental psychologists have interesting contributions to make to understand this phenomenon. CPTED stands for Crime Prevention Through Environment Design, which is a kind of literature that could fill whole libraries, which emerged in the 70s and is now on the rise again, I would say. The problem with this way of thinking is that for some people it smells like social engineering, determinism, manipulation, behaviorism, and I think there is a real danger there, and therefore we need more nuanced tools to understand the agency of the material world around us. I'm not going into the details here, happy to discuss later on. So, as conclusion, interim conclusion, I believe the urban environment can do things. It's not neutral. It has an agency. It can sometimes be enrolled intentionally to do something, and sometimes it has unintended side effects. If that's the case, well, it's not a far step from here to argue that the urban environment can accentuate and potentially also alleviate the social practices of conflict. A few examples. Belfast, just a screenshot from Google Maps. This is the Westling Highway. There used to be an old bridge. This is an old image. It was dismantled in the context of a multi-million refurbishment of the old motorway there. The idea was to replace this bridge with a newer one, but disability legislation came in and they had to build a ramp for wheelchair users. So what you can see there is the foundation of the ramp, which meant that the new bridge came to be built about here. So it was moved by about 50 meters from the original location. So this is the flashy wheelchair ramp. This is the other side of the bridge, which has a circular ramp. We can just focus on this. I'm zooming in on this bit now. From here, this spot is a perfect launching spot for stones, missiles, whatever, onto these Catholic houses. So before that bridge was built, this opportunity to act out, to enact aggression wasn't there. And now with this bridge built, there's every weekend, usually Friday and Saturday evening, there's trouble going on there. Police rushing in, residents there have started to protect their cars with cardboards, protect their windows with metal wires, etc. And the authorities had to come in and erect a new peace wall to keep the stones, at least the low-flying stones, from attacking these residences. So my question here, we had this discussion earlier about responsibility. Who is responsible? Of course, the young, bored, sometimes drunken kids who throw stones are to blame, but had the engineers come up with a different solution for the ramp, this problem wouldn't be here. But a positive example as well from Belfast. This is an aerial image of the new the Odyssey Arena, an ice rink, which is remarkable insofar as most types of sports in Northern Ireland are associated with one of the two groups. So hurling is nationalist, Catholic, Republican, Irish. Tennis is English, loyalist, unionist, etc. Ice hockey had no association. And some clever people came up with the idea, let's build an ice hockey rink that people can share a neutral passion. And they needed a space for that. So materiality was enrolled in an attempt to bring people from both sides of the divide together. And it's working quite successfully. The Belfast Giants are doing pretty well in the ice hockey, I heard. We have 5 more minutes. A few examples from Beirut. The project we ran compared the situation in Belfast, Beirut, Berlin and Amsterdam. Just a few words about Beirut there. You can see the signs of previous atrocities. They're decades old. Holes, bullet holes, old wounds. Whoever passes by is reminded there was something going on. In other cases, old wounds are kept open deliberately, and this is in the city centre at Tent. I apologise for the bad quality of the image, where it's a temporary grave for the former Prime Minister Rafi Hariri, and there's actually a sign there, not well to see, that counts the days from the day of the assassination. That's perpetually refreshed the memory of this assassination, visually and materially. Defensive infrastructure, pervasive in all these cities. A mirror which allows to look under the underside of cars, because this is where typically car bombs were mounted. So people tried to protect themselves with makeshift material interventions. Is this, I'm wondering, the display of individual identity, or is it the beginning of territorial demarcation? It's the Virgin Mary kind of set back in a private property, but clearly visual from the street where the photographer, stood. That shrine could have been moved just half a meter to the right, and it wouldn't have been a statement. In this case, it is a statement. Sometimes these statements are much more official. Solidification of tribal identity might be a way to describe that. In the background, again, the Virgin Mary, a huge poster there. Not that elaborate ways to claim territory with stencils, a face of one of the actors in that political dispute, General Aoun. In the city centre, a new mosque has been built, which for some Christians is an offence, a visual, material offence, because actually it blocks the line of sight from the Christian cathedral to the main Christian residential area. In the city centre, some litter bins are open, some are closed. In these areas, they're closed where particular threats from bomb attacks are expected, because you can place a bomb in there, but you can't. That's not that unusual. I just threw in that image from London. These litter bins apparently are being installed in London. They're bomb-proof. Again, good signs, I would say. Gates being dismantled at the very same location. This one's taken, oops. The upper image was taken before the bottom one. Okay. An agreement was reached to remove political posters and signage in the city centre a while ago. So it was overpainted. Of course, it is easy to recognize for locals what it was, an Amal sign. Some make clever attempts to avoid this game of signage and territorialization and try to use neutral, apparently neutral, symbolism. In that case, it's Phoenician symbols, which apparently is neutral and accepted as some sort of legacy amongst all social, political ethnic groups in Lebanon. This is a particularly interesting case, a shopping mall being erected right at the boundary between two communities. And we were in contact with the manager there, who says the architect had a really hard time to come up with color schemes to indicate the level of the parking space that is not associated with any of the political groups. Orange would be problematic because everybody would think that's an allegiance to that group. Green is problematic, yellow is problematic. So they came up with this, just come really well across, different innovative shades of color shapes. And something as simple as stairs can be a positive intervention, because it facilitates, in a very literal sense, enables people to cross boundaries. As this is along Damascus Road, which was the dividing line between the main atrocities in the Civil War. I think let's keep something here and jump to some conclusions. Of course, I do absolutely not argue that design can solve conflicts. No, clearly not. But I would argue that design must not be neglected in reconciliation efforts. It can sometimes be the nucleus that brings people together around a table and, if for the first time, talk about a building, a store, a stair, or something, which is hands-on, practical, nitty-gritty, instead of big, high-flying political concepts. From what we've discovered in these 4 cities, I think we can say that design process is in many ways at least as important as the design content. And as a recommendation, people with the power to influence the shape of the material urban fabric, sounds very complicated, but I think it makes sense to be that specific. It can make it harder to execute atrocities, so this is the idea of crime prevention through environmental design. But on a more ambitious or more positive outlook, I also think people who genuinely want peace should consider how the urban environment can be enrolled in their efforts. Project results, some papers, of course, the special journal issue, which Michael thankfully mentioned. An exhibition is currently touring through our 4 case study cities. And if this works, there should be a few images from the exhibition launch. Oh. Well, in that case, thank you very much.
We'll move straight on to our next speaker, Sarah Freganesi, who did her doctorate in geography at Newcastle. It was on the subject of city war and geopolitics, political violence, and Beirut's built environment in the Lebanese Civil War. I'm correct in thinking you did your fieldwork in Lebanon yourself, didn't you? She's currently a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I mean, indicated already that she and Ralph cooperated in a special journal article. She will be talking to us today about the herbicide of Beirut. That's correct. Good. Of Beirut, political violence, geopolitical discourse, and built environment during the 2 Years' War, 1975-1976. Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ralph. And thanks to all the very powerful contributions through the morning and yesterday. I'm going to remain in Beirut geographically, although I'm moving back in time. So I'm going to speak about the civil war, the very first few phases of it. I want just to remark one point that was made this morning during the presentation on Uganda. Although I've been doing fieldwork in Beirut for a while now, and I have developed my personal network, it's not my conflict, so I am aware that the stakes for me in research in Lebanon are much lower than those that an insider would have. So the research results I'm going to present here are obviously mediated by my interviews and my fieldwork process and the sources I used. So today I would like to address a couple of questions about neighborly violence in Beirut. However, they're also meant at raising wider points. Firstly, how do dynamics of political violence, including polarization, population transfers, ID killings, and so on, all episodes of Anton in Beirut during the conflict, how does this political violence involve the surrounding physical environment? And secondly, how does political violence that involves the built environment connect to what we traditionally understand as geopolitics and the representation of international conflict? I will first try and situate my work within the main themes addressed by the emerging field of urban geopolitics, and stress the geopolitical purchase of the idea of urbicide, which literally means killing the city, killing the urban. And then I'll give a brief general overview of Lebanon's and especially Beirut's conflict, and then I will pass to a case study about a neighborhood in southeastern Beirut, okay. So, for the sake of this discussion, in my view, we can identify a few thematic strands in the literature in urban geopolitics, and they are by no means monolithic or distinct, but we could identify a few. There is an architectural strand which is made of literature that I will let you put in the PowerPoint. It's made of literature that conceives architecture and planning as agents of social disruption, or even as weapons of political violence. There's a cultural strand which is mostly based on the idea that attacks against cities are attacks against the idea or a certain idea of civility that is supposedly embodied by the city. There is a philosophical strand whose main aim is to unsettle the modern Cartesian classical dichotomy between humans and non-humans, subject and object during warfare, and thus unsettles the philosophical and ethical hierarchy between people as victims of conflict and buildings as targets of conflict. So Martin Coer especially says we should adopt a non-anthropocentric outlook of conflict alongside studying human victims, and also look at the material damage and at the targeting of specific buildings as signs of a certain political violence strategy. And then a fourth strand is a strand that has more to do with geopolitics and issues of sovereignty, and is a series of studies dealing with the city and the violent city, the attacked city, vis-a-vis issues of state power and international conflict. I will build now on this last geopolitics strand. And my first argument today is that narratives of urban death as a post-Cold War novelty in urban geopolitics should be complexified by looking at the continuity of civil conflict across what is usually conceived as the 1989 watershed between an era of balance between two blocks, two global blocks, the Soviet and the US bloc, and an era of reawaked ancient ethnic hatreds. Literature in urban geopolitics stresses the novelty of the centrality of material infrastructure of contemporary cities to conflict. However, urban geopolitics has also called for more analysis of continuities between supposedly new attacks and old ones. But despite this, there is still a scarce number of studies of past conflict, and an even scarcer quantity of studies that deal with urban warfare that involves non-state actors. Although obviously there are some studies about Cold War American inner cities and Second World War area bombing, there is very little that urban geopolitics has investigated about pre-1989 interconnections between cities and conflict, and let alone about neighborly violence, so civil war. This concentration on post-Cold War violence connects two things. On one hand, the accepted fact that by now more than half of the world population is in cities. And on the other hand, the observation that urban spaces are becoming increasingly geopolitically charged. So in other words, because people live in cities, then cities become more geopolitically significant. So this idea that global dynamics are increasingly being rescaled into cities, in my view, can be balanced and complexified by analyzing violent geographies as, rather than rescaling, as multi-sided. Urban spaces are becoming increasingly geopolitically charged. So in other words, because people live in cities, then cities become more geopolitically significant. So this idea that global dynamics are increasingly being rescaled into cities, in my view, can be balanced and complexified by analyzing violent geographies as, rather than rescaling, as multi-sided. In other words, urban violent geographies are shaped by hybrid practices that are global and local at the same time. Okay, now, brief overview of the Lebanese conflict war, because I don't know those of you who know about this. The war in Beirut and in Lebanon, all over Lebanon, started in 1975, lasted until 1990. I'm just going to give a very geographical overview. The first 2 years of wars, which are the ones I'm going to focus today on, are usually called the 2 years war. The war starts in April 75, and this is the phase I like to call of Beirut seen from the street. It's mainly a phase of street by street fight, building by building, a phase of boundary negotiation and settling through irregular intermediate rounds of street warfare. Differently, very different from the following phase, starting after a brief lull in 1978, where air power seems to become the protagonist, with the Syrian and the Israeli armies entering Lebanon and using bombardments to target the city as a whole. So it's almost a dehumanization of targets. We have no more the close quarter fighting, we have the targeting from the air, from the distance. The further phase in the 80s, we have a further fragmentation and rupture inside militias, followed by the last phase, which is the phase where agreements are reached. There is a phase of resistance to those agreements, leading to more fighting, followed by resolution and final reconstruction. Yes, okay, you can see the green line in the middle. That is the main division that characterized Beirut's war. Okay, while focusing on the first 2 years of war, first of all, this is the phase of street fight. As you can see in the first quote, the practice of piercing holes in the walls was used as a tactic, normal tactic of urban warfare. It's a phase when neighborly violence literally comes to the neighborhood, because we have the settling and the negotiating of the main front lines in the city through daily fighting and everyday fighting practices among the militias. It's also a phase in which the progression from episodic to more systematic and organized political violence goes in parallel with the intensity of attacks against certain buildings. And here the Holiday Inn portrayed in these two posters produced by one of the militias fighting at the time as propaganda. The Holiday Inn is only an extremely visible and striking example of this process. Therefore, this phase of day-by-day and street-by-street fighting offers us a valuable platform for studying in depth the relation between perpetrators of political violence and the built environment, and therefore to understand better the shaping of localized geopolitical knowledges. In this phase, the geopolitical construction of Lebanon by the international community subjugated militias' claims and practices as, what we would say unsurprisingly so, anomalous, irresponsible, illogical, irrational, or simply irrelevant, and disqualified these knowledges from shaping any understanding of the Lebanese conflict. This vision, and this is crucial to understand the importance of the 2 years' war, justified an international policy of non-intervention that was aimed at safeguarding the conflict from escalating to a regional level. So it was a very hands-off geopolitical construction of Lebanon and a very hands-off policy towards the conflict. So while regional neighbors and Cold War superpowers conceived Lebanon as a space of chaos, by way of contrast instead, former militia members that I interviewed, alongside journalists, local architects, and urban experts, rendered as witnesses a rather different view of Beirut at war, where the militia geographies possessed instead some logics of sort. During my fieldwork in 2005, I was interested in the mundane and the material aspects of the war, such as the relationship of individual fighters to portions of the city fabric or the role of buildings within wider fighting practices. So, for example, here we have a few quotes about the importance of the holiday inn for different belongers of different militias, or the importance of the media in publicizing attacks to individual buildings in order to augment the power and the influence of a militia within certain neighbors. So researching herbicide can be a tool for exploring subjugated and everyday geopolitical knowledges and for understanding neighborly violence, at least as much as we can understand about it by analyzing official accounts. Now I am going to offer a glimpse of these everyday geopolitical knowledges as they were mobilized by militia fighters during neighborly fighting. I will focus on the neighborhood of Ain al-Lemene, which is with respect to the center. The city center of Beirut is this area, and this is where the green line crosses, and the red square is the neighborhood of Ain al-Lemene. It used to be a rural area that in the 1960s it became urbanized and included in Greater Beirut administratively. It's the place, it's important because it's the place, the neighborhood where one of the most famous incidents in April 1975 happened that sparkled sectarian clashes that then gave the start to the main phases of the conflict. So we can say that it's where the war started on 13 April 75. What you see on the right is a poster that has been produced in 1978 by a militia called the Lebanese Forces, mainly Christian, mainly. The neighborhood of Ain al-Lemene soon, at the beginning of the war, became a stronghold for recruiting young fighters and for the resistance of this part of the city against the other part. And so this is a poster that has been produced as an act of propaganda. And what we see in this poster are references to specific political geographies and international geopolitical discourses that transcend and blur the boundaries between the local and the global, the internal and the foreign. Okay, first we see a map of Lebanon. We see a map of Lebanon on the right-hand side, but the map is carved from the rest of its surroundings. These boundaries correspond to the boundaries inherited by Lebanon from the French colonial mandate. And this map reflects the attachment of this specific militia to an idea of Lebanese sovereignty with clearly marked boundaries. This idea is counterposed to the rather different territorial imagination of other militias fighting in the city, whose idea of sovereignty instead viewed Lebanon as embedded in a greater pan-Arab, greater Arab region. There is a reference to this other view, which is quite orientalistic and pejorative in this poster. Under those feet that you see that the building has, you see many dots. It's a crowd, and there is a small Arabic script here, which says the animal Arab tribes. So Arabs, Pan-Arabism is portrayed as something very crowded, very messy, and tribal and animal. So there is a creation of a discourse about us and them. So the geographical references used in this poster transcend the locality of the idea of sect and merge it with wider and well-established geopolitical imaginations, and translate them into a narrative that is reproduced through the built environment of a neighborhood like Aner-Remane and its popular buildings. The building. You can see the building is portrayed with, it's got eyes, nose, a mouth, it's got limbs, it's running, it's holding a flame. The building as agency is wounded. It's a reference to the attack and the scorching of the surface of the buildings during the street fighting. And it carries on its shoulders a map. It carries on its shoulders the map of Lebanon. And if you look at the Arabic script in the map of Lebanon, it says the Lebanese question. So the Lebanese questions of boundaries, how do we define Lebanon? So the very neighborhood, what is usually depicted as the local dimension, is the one that brings on its very own shoulders the whole of Lebanon and the Lebanese question with its international and colonial references. So we could ask, where is the local and where is the global in the militia geographical imagination in Beirut? To conclude, back to the initial questions. The built environment, we could say that the built environment is not an inert background where neighborly violence simply happens, but an active player in the redefinition of contested territorial regions had by fighters. In Beirut, traditional geopolitical definitions of Lebanon in the map of global politics were redrawn by militias. And these redrawings acquired real and localized power, which managed to change the everyday life of thousands of Beirutis for the years to come. These rationalities and the infrastructure where they were deployed need to be further investigated. The geopolitical state of herbicide resides in the fact that the built environment is not simply the target either, but the very medium for intervening in global diagrams of power through specific urban landscapes and modify them. This happens not only through destruction, but also through a series of other practices that intervene in the everyday life of inhabitants, for example, putting barricades, blocking roads, and including ruination of buildings, looting, and finally the celebration of urban monuments for militia resistance, such as we've seen in the case of the Holiday Inn. So, what I would like to give you to take away today is that a qualitative in-depth approach to the targeting of the urban built environment, or herbicide, can blur the fictional boundary between subjugated and official geopolitical knowledges, and make significant the role of the built environment in producing new imaginative geographies of a city and its residents, or of a whole country and its place in the world.
Thank you.
I think we have about half an hour for questions. Before we begin, just let me turn to the two speakers. Did you have any comments? Each other's speakers. Yeah.
I'm curious, Sarah. I think it's fascinating how you demonstrate that and how geopolitical, big, abstract disputes, discussions are enacted in a hotel or hotels and certain stories from which you can shoot better than from others, etc. I think that's very rich, fascinating. I'm asking, is there a lesson to be learned when we try to foster reconciliation efforts, promote peace, etc.? Is there something to be learned from Lebanon, from your empirical material?
Wow. And the matter of reconciliation is very complex in Lebanon. However, on the material side, as you started your presentation talking about literacy, I guess one thing we can take away is that although this seemed like very almost individual testimonies or stories, first of all, reconciliation, as we see in tribunals, are actually made of individual stories by listening to individual testimonies. But also, irrational and irresponsible and local they are not. Because, first of all, these materialities that the fighters produced change the life of normal villages forever. And also the way in which the city is redeveloped in Thailand has to take into account these very stories and the material signs that the material presences that they produce. The Holiday Inn is still standing there in the city center of Beirut. It's the only building that hasn't been redeveloped in the city center, although it's within the perimeter of the reconstruction area because of a dispute between owners and developers, as it is often the case. So I think they shouldn't be underestimated as militia stories that have nothing to offer. Actually, they have recreated the city, and we have to deal with it nowadays. And then, okay, if you want to talk about the reconciliation process in Lebanon, we could open another window. So, maybe another question.
Questions from the floor? Sorry, let me start by really picking up on Rolf's point there as well, which is, with the Holiday Inn now standing, is it standing with bullet holes and shrapnel still in it or not? And the reason I'm asking, and this is a question for both of you, it goes back to issues about memorialization, mourning. To what extent do you want to leave damaged herbicidal monuments standing as a remembrance of the conflict and a way to say, let's not go back to that? For many years in Rwanda, in the capital, they left the parliament building deliberately with pockmarked full of shells, precisely as a memorial to what happened and the attempt to destroy the parliament building. And there's a whole sort of iconography to that as well.
Where is this?
Rwanda.
Rwanda. Yes. I asked many people about why the Holiday Inn is standing like that. First of all, it's completely devoid of any political poster signs. There is a photographic dossier about it. A professional photographer went inside. It's on the web. And he went inside at a point in which there were still graffitis on the internal walls. Someone had removed the little mosaic tiles from a bathroom or something and had created a writing, an acronym of a party or a symbol. All these fascinating things. Now it's all cleaned up. It's a shell. It's a skeleton. I asked many people why. And the answer has always been, as often it is in Lebanon, it's about money, it's about a dispute of property. It's not because we want to leave it there as a remembrance. Sometimes they put very big banners to publicize events or chains of shops. So about memory, the reconciliation, there has been general amnesty in Lebanon in 1991, absolving all the fighters from whatever crime they committed. So there is this sort of limbo. The former fighters can't really speak publicly about what they did because the society is not reconciliated. School curricula stops in 1975. But however, they are completely free to speak about it in private. There is a monument about memory, an attempt to create a shared imaginative community in memory. It's located outside Beirut, near the presidential palace, in Baata, up in the hills. It's not in the center of Beirut. Now, and I need to follow that up, I haven't really followed, I should. I saw an article in the Lebanese press about Solidad, the private company that is in charge with the reconstruction of the Beirut City Center. They launched an international competition, a Lebanese competition for designing a monument for remembering the civil war to put in the center of town. So that is quite, there is no amnesty, there is no Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some sort in Lebanon. There is only the special tribunal for the Hariri kill. However, there is this kind of reworking of memory going on, but I don't know about the nuances of it.
Say a word from just my experience in Belfast. In a way, maybe you could call it a material amnesty that some people try to promote in Belfast or Northern Ireland more generally, where they try to slowly, with community involvement, to remove the most aggressive murals and to replace them with neutral symbols, pictures like George Best, for example, is accepted as a football hero by both communities. So you see George Best murals, or you see murals commemorating the dock workers' strike from 1910, where Catholics and Protestants were involved. So this is a very important point that we raised. There are ways to deal with that. There's no silver bullet to handle that, but it is an important part of these efforts.
Can I say just one more thing about Beirut, because it's really important, and it also came up in the project. When we were looking at the tent city in the center of Beirut, that the tent city that Hezbollah set up for completely new reasons, we are in a contemporary setting. There is a picture that we took with, there's a poster, a banner hanging from the flyover that passes through the city center. And it's about Ma'ruf Saad. Ma'ruf Saad was the mayor of Saida in South Lebanon, who got shot. There's no agreed version about by whom, got shot before the start of the war in 1975. And the poster said something like "Martyr for Freedoms." So there is, and I have pictures of people coming into the demonstrations after Hariri's death with posters of Sheikh Bashir Ismail, who was the head of the Lebanese Phalanges militia. So there are windows open that, because there was no amnesty, there was no reconciliation process, and there is no shared version, it's full of obduracy of these artifacts, kind of reminders from another time that are still present. And it's very important. They're all around in different forms.
I guess this is mainly for Ralph. Yeah, it seems like to think about avoiding polarization in the urban environment may go in some conflict with a working through that we've been talking about through the conference. You know, where a working through would involve an acknowledgement, a remembering, a narrativizing in a certain way. And I just wonder about the tension between those two. I mean, if we can only look to examples of George Best in 1910 and not do anything about, not narrativize in any way. I mean, here's a counterexample I was thinking of the Vietnam War Memorial, and sure you're familiar with, which, you know, is subject to some criticism, but it's kind of an interestingly brilliant narrativization that commemorates the war and the loss of U.S. soldiers. It only has the names of all the U.S. soldiers who lost their lives. But there's no way I think you can interpret that memorial as glory, you know, in the terms of glory, of war as glory, because it's just death. And, you know, so it's not an erasure, it's not neutral, it's not, you know, ignoring it, but it's a narrativizing that does have a kind of point and gives something to all sides in a certain respect. So I just wonder about that tension between the wanting to avoid polarization, but then the working toward the work of thought.
I think I can only agree that this tension is very much existent and present and troubles people in the cities we visited. There are attempts, for example, in Belfast, to commemorate the victims on both sides in one memorial to commemorate the victim on both sides. That hasn't gained enough support yet, so it's still in the debate. But this is exactly along the lines of the debate, the dilemma that you raised here.
I just wanted to jump in and sort of join in this particular debate because it interests me a great deal. I think part of what you were speaking to actually is the issue of sequencing, which increasingly is coming up in the context of transitional justice. This idea that different mechanisms may be appropriate at different times, and that's also consistent with a lot of trauma theory, which is that you can't, you need to do things in a certain sequence, and sometimes it takes many years. So yes, memorialization and commemoration are extremely important. When that takes place, though, will differ depending on the context. So sort of usually when you're looking at trauma theory, the first step is to reestablish safety. And there's often for communities a certain level of wanting to forget and wanting to just move on with things and wanting to reestablish normality. And then after several years, or sometimes even as much as a generation, is when these echoes start coming back, and that's when people's needs may change. And I mean, this is sort of relatively new. I don't think there's been a lot of work done trying to draw parallels between psychological sequencing in trauma and sort of justice sequencing in terms of transitional justice. Is something I'm very personally interested in. But I think what you're saying actually speaks to that there may come a time when sort of explicit memorials and remembrances are necessary. It may also be that right after the peace deal is signed, people just may want to forget.
I've got a question about interpretation, really. It's really a question to Ralph. Because you're talking about what the built environment and the environment does. And I was thinking about some of the examples, and I thought that actually you could read them in lots of different ways. So if you have the sort of the bridge, which was overlooking the Catholic houses, in some ways that gives people an opportunity to throw stones. But on the other hand, you could see it as a mode of saying, well, we trust people enough not to throw stones in a different space. And there's a cul-de-sac as well. I mean, it could make people feel lonely, but it could also make people feel like they belong to a small group. So what does an architect do with the problem of interpretation?
I wish conventional mainstream architects asked this question to themselves more frequently. I'm teaching in a school of architecture. My impression is that 90% of our students, they just want to become the next Sir Norman Foster, and it's all about aesthetics and about design. And you see many student presentations with flashy, fancy buildings, and there's no human being on visually on the image. I don't have the answer to your question, and but I wish it was more a debate among contemporary architecture, education, and practice. The issue you raise is something we struggle a lot in our research. We call it the danger of reverse engineering. You see something, and you speculate about what what kind of process might have led to this object, to this building, to this particular shape of a public square. You could go terribly wrong in your interpretation. So in our approach, I mean, it means that we have to interview the architects, the planners, the politicians, the funders, the developers. We have to kind of like a Sherlock Holmes story, trying to trace the path that led to this particular building, which is important. I hope we didn't go awfully wrong, but sometimes we might have, yes. And this is the role of academia and constructive criticism to point these things out. I'm grateful for that.
I had a question about mapping and polarization expressed in kind of urban context. And kind of I can speak from my experience in Caracas in Venezuela, where political polarization has been kind of escalating quite constantly. And as political polarization has escalated, the way maps are constructed has changed. And for instance, before the political polarization, some areas were not necessarily mapped because they were not part of a reality. But now that they are politically active areas, they're being mapped. And now they're part of the political reality because they are being mapped. Or I'm not sure if it's they're being mapped because of part of. So it's weird to understand which came first. Is it the naming of the space or the space of the political significance? So I'm not sure if that is also happening in Belfast and Beirut.
Yes, maps are important. There are all sorts of, from speaking from our research, all sorts of visuals produced by militias that actually talk about maps. The importance of yes, you lose the sense of which comes first. It's not a map, but it's a building. The Holiday Inn was already contested somehow. It was a very new building when the war started. It was very contested between the two main groups, I think. In certain terms. Because of this contestation and because of also its position in the city, it became a kind of symbol. And because it became a symbol of that, kind of epitomized those, it brought those contested ideas to a more extreme level. It became almost a symbol on the map of Beirut, of division. We come across maps. Another map that comes to my mind is the way of mapping the reconstructed city center in Beirut. If you look at their official publication, it's a very glossy book, and there's a map of the city center which is very vivid, and everything is zoned, and here we put the archaeology, and here we put the commerce, and this is a preserved building, blah blah. And then you have a kind of blurry surrounding, and that's the rest of Beirut. We don't deal with that. And this is, it's the map becoming reality. There's a certain street, I think it's Guro Street, it's the street that goes off from the city center on the east into the Christian neighborhood. There's a building with a pet shop on the ground floor, and you see a line, and on your left, the building on your left is, the piece of building on your left is brand new. The facade is completely repainted, it's nice sandstone. The piece of facade on the right is still with bullet holes, not bullet holes, but they're scorched. That's the boundary of Solidar. That's the boundary of the private company that reconstructs the city center. That's the boundary of the map on the glossy book. Because they only develop buildings until a certain point, that's all. That's their perimeter. So, yes, the maps do influence reality.
So, I think it's kind of a hen and egg phenomenon that you can observe there. So sometimes the mapper, the person who draws a map, tries to represent something. I mean, in reality, boundaries are usually more fuzzy and fluid than I can draw with a pen. But once I put down the pen and I draw that line, and then I publish that map, I create something, and someone living on that boundary might see that map in the newspaper and think, I didn't know I'm in a Catholic neighborhood. And suddenly it creates, or it hardens, it solidifies identities and boundaries, and that's usually problematic.
It's also for the, if I can just add in for the theme of religious segregation or polarization, maps are particularly crucial because obviously the way you write the world and you represent it has influence on real life. When you see that there's plenty of books about how to lie with maps, and especially when we look at aerial maps of the area distribution of sects in Lebanon. You see the entire south of Lebanon looks like it's a Shia stronghold. Instead, you have to look at the density of the population as well. So you will find out that the south is not as densely populated as Beirut or the north, for example. So if you superimpose a density map over an area map, you will find out that, okay, the area is mostly Shia, but the number of people that live in that area is probably less than another Christian area somewhere else that looks much smaller on the map. So it's representations, it's not the truth.
Sorry, just a quick question for Ralph. Does Jane Jacobs have anything to, is her theories about urban space applicable to reconstruction, reconciliation in formerly divided or still somewhat divided cities?
Yes. Because I think simply because Jane Jacobs raised the important fact and told us how it works, that human beings matter much more than you can represent on a map. That the nitty-gritty, sometimes called irrational, existential fears, concerns, preferences of people in real life, on the street, they matter. And this is what Jane Jacobs taught us. And this is what matters hugely in reconciliation efforts. Again, an example from Belfast, where a very successful reconciliation case at an interface, previously quite violent interface, where Catholics and Protestants, interestingly, mainly women, initially met in secret talks and said, how can we move this forward? We're fed up with our violent history. Fast forward about 8 years or almost 10 years of negotiations. There's now a building that has a cafe, a chemist, small fashion stores, and finally the supermarket that caters to members of both communities. And interestingly, as an architectural response to that complex situation, the building has a corridor through the middle with an exit or entry point on the Catholic side and the Protestant side. In rational planning terms, this is an inefficient use of space. You could have put in another retail unit in there. But the people, obviously the architect understood the concerns of the people and said, okay, just in case something happens, trouble breaks out, the Catholics can go out this way, the Protestants can go out that way. And it might sound ridiculous in a way, but it is just a very important way of taking human beings serious. And again, that's, I guess, Jane Jacobs would sign off to that, I think.
Final question, anybody? Okay, well, actually we've been finished almost perfectly on time then. I think both of you give us a lot to think about. Thank you, Zara, for your papers. Please join me in thanking her again.